The first thing they told you about Commander Dax Rail was that he never looked at his own statue. It stood in the center of Compound 7's main square, 12 feet of cast resin and recycled hull plating, depicting a man with his arm outstretched and his fist closed around something you couldn't see. The sculptor had never met him. She'd worked from a single blurry photograph taken during the hive breach at Kepler Station, the one where a human logistics officer had walked through a pressurized corridor with no suit, no weapon, and a look on his face like he was mildly annoyed at the inconvenience. The Voth had taken that photograph, nobody knew how. The working theory was that one of the drone swarm units had malfunctioned just long enough to capture it before the interference went back up. The Voth themselves had shared it, not as propaganda, but as something closer to a warning. A classified memo from their High Communion had circulated through every resistance network within 8 years. We have examined this image for 17 cycles. We have not yet determined what expression the human is making. We do not believe it is fear. 17 years later, Marin Sokals had that memo pinned to the wall above her bunk. She was 26 years old, born inside Compound 7's maintenance ring, and she had never seen Commander Dax Rail in person. Nobody in the compound had. He'd gone dark at Kepler Station during the breach, classified missing, presumed dead, then reclassified to operational status unknown, then classified again to something the senior staff wouldn't name out loud. What he'd done at Kepler was public record only in the way that things you couldn't fully explain became public record. Everyone knew the broad shape of it, and the details kept shifting depending on who was telling the story. The Voth had come to harvest. That much was agreed upon. Kepler Station had been a transit hub, 17,000 civilians, nowhere to run. The evacuation ships had already been disabled. The hive had sent a communion choir, 48 psychic resonators cycling at a frequency that shut down voluntary motor control in most carbon-based nervous systems. The humans on Kepler should have been standing still, blinking, waiting. Instead, according to the official resistance record, one man had walked toward the choir through a corridor that smelled like ozone and burning plastic, had covered 400 meters at a pace that witnesses described as a stroll, had reached the central resonance point, and had done something that disrupted the choir's frequency permanently. The 48 Voth resonators had collapsed within 12 seconds. The evacuation window had opened. 14,000 people had made it out. What Rail had done to disrupt the choir was the part that kept changing. The engineers said he'd reconfigured a coolant manifold to act as an acoustic dampener. The pilots said he'd used his own body as a ground conductor for the resonance spike. The oldest mechanic in Compound 7, a woman named Brecht who drank engine cleaner-proof coffee and refused to discuss anything she hadn't personally witnessed, said that what he'd done was hum. He hummed something, Brecht had told Marin once 3 years ago while replacing a relay panel that didn't need replacing. Not a melody, not words, just a low sound he kept steady while he walked. I saw the readouts. The choir's frequency started sliding the moment he started, just drifted, like it didn't know what to do with something that wasn't afraid. Is that possible? Marin had asked. Brecht had shrugged. He's been gone for 17 years. People have had time to make it make sense. Marin had been running Compound 7's resistance cell for 8 months by the time the transport arrived. Not because she was the most experienced. That was Oren, who had been fighting since before she was born, and who had the kind of calm that came from having survived enough disasters to stop treating them as unusual. Not because she was the most strategic. That was Pillar, who could diagram a Voth patrol cycle on a napkin in under 2 minutes, and who had once navigated a full cell extraction using only a maintenance schematic and a bad attitude. Marin was in charge because she was the one who couldn't sleep and therefore noticed everything, which in a resistance compound translated to something roughly equivalent to leadership. She noticed things like the transport's arrival vector, which was wrong. It came in from the sunward side, which nobody used, because the Voth's long-range thermal sensors were angled exactly that direction to catch exactly the kind of heat plume a ship's engine would produce. Coming from sunward was either a mistake or a deliberate sacrifice of stealth for something else. She noticed the way the landing struts touched down in a pattern she'd only seen in training files, a specific three-point contact that old resistance pilots used when they didn't trust the ground. Someone on that ship was being careful in a very old-fashioned way. She noticed that the cargo manifest the ship pinged to Compound 7's receiving system was entirely routine, 6 lines of standard supply code, except that the 6th line contained a product designation that corresponded to nothing in the current catalog. She looked it up in the archive and found it was a designation that had been retired from active use 17 years ago. She was already at the landing bay when the hatch opened. He looked smaller than the statue. That was the first thing she thought, and she immediately felt idiotic for thinking it, because of course he did. He was a person, and the statue was 12 feet tall. He was probably 6 feet, broad across the shoulders, wearing a maintenance jacket that had been patched so many times the original color was genuinely unclear. His hair was going gray at the temples. He had a scar along his jaw that hadn't been in the photograph, because it hadn't happened yet when the photograph was taken. He stepped off the ramp and looked around the landing bay with the expression of a man who had been in enough places that arriving somewhere new didn't require any particular reaction. Then he looked at her. "You're the one who runs the cell," he said. It wasn't a question. "Marin Sakals," she said. "You're." "Rael," he said it like it was just a name. "I need to see your comms setup, your patrol schedule, and whoever does your medical. In that order." "There's a statue of you in the main square," she said. He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I know. You never look at it." "I've seen it." He picked up his kit. "Comms first." She gave him the tour in silence and watched him take in each room with the same unhurried attention. He didn't ask questions while she showed him things. He waited until she stopped moving, and then asked 3 or 4 that were so specific she realized he'd been cataloging everything she'd been about to explain before she could explain it. He knew what a comms array looked like when it was undershielded. He knew which medical supplies indicated what kind of engagement tempo a cell was running. He spotted that their water recycling system had a faulty bypass valve without being anywhere near the engineering room. He'd noticed a moisture trail on the corridor wall that she'd looked at every day for 6 months without registering. "How long have you been operating?" he asked when they reached the briefing room. "The cell as it is now, 8 months. The compound itself has been here since the breach." "Who's been running it since the breach?" "Different people, Oren mostly." She gestured to the man who was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching Rael with an expression that was carefully neutral. "Oren Cast. He was here before I was born." Rael looked at Oren for a moment. "Cast. You were at Varani Station." Oren's expression shifted, barely perceptibly. "Before your time." "Before my time publicly," Rael said. "I read the tactical debriefs. You got 14 people out of a sealed structure that was actively being demolished around you. What you did with the emergency blast panels was, I used a version of it at Kepler." Something changed in Oren's face. Not softening exactly, more like a door opening slightly, reluctant and barely wide enough to notice. "I heard what happened at Kepler," Oren said. "Most of what you heard is wrong," Rael said. "Some of it is right. I'll tell you which is which when we have time." He looked around the room. "What's your current threat?" This was the question Marin had been waiting to answer, because it was the question she'd been chewing on for 3 weeks and hadn't been able to get anyone to take seriously enough. "Voth harmonic unit," she said. "Mobile. We've seen it twice on the periphery of the compound scan range. It doesn't match any standard patrol configuration we have on file." "How many resonators?" "We can't get an accurate count. The signal's different from anything in the archive. Rail was quiet for a moment. Different how? Lower. Standard communion choir frequency ranges from 8 to 12 kilohertz on the primary output. This is reading at 3. The room was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. That's new, Rail said. And the way he said it, careful, not alarmed, but careful, told Marin that this was the first time in this entire conversation that something had surprised him. We know, she said. 3 kilohertz doesn't work on humans the same way. It's not paralysis frequency. He stopped, ran through something in his head. It's the frequency range that affects motivation, decision-making, the part of the nervous system that tells you that what you're doing is worth continuing. We've had 4 cell members request reassignment in the past 3 weeks, Oren said quietly. 2 others stopped eating. They didn't lose motor control. They just stopped. They stopped what? Believing it mattered. Oren's voice was flat. That's the part we can't put in a report. How do you write down that someone stopped believing it mattered? Rail sat down. It was the first time since he'd arrived that he'd sat. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. The Voth learned something at Kepler, he said. It took them 17 years to work out what it was. What I did at Kepler wasn't a technical fix. It was the frequency I used was one that the choir hadn't modeled. They'd modeled everything they thought humans would feel when they were facing extinction. Fear, despair, anger. They hadn't modeled what a human sounds like when they're irritated. A pause. I was genuinely annoyed at them. That probably sounds. It sounds exactly like the file, Marin said. He looked at her. Which file? The Voth memo, the one they shared in the first year. We have not yet determined what expression the human is making. We do not believe it is fear. She had it memorized. 17 years, Commander. They've been trying to figure you out for 17 years. And what they landed on was 3 kilohertz, the frequency that turns off the part of you that thinks anything is worth doing. Because that's what they think beat them, he said slowly. They think it was certainty, unshakable certainty that it was worth doing. Wasn't it? He was quiet for a long time. I didn't know whether it would work, he said. I still don't know exactly what worked. I just knew that standing still wasn't the option and moving forward was the only direction available, and if I was going to walk toward 48 Voth resonators, I was going to walk at a pace that wasn't running. He looked up. I was annoyed at them for being there. I'd been on shift for 22 hours. I hadn't eaten. The corridor smelled terrible. I just wanted them gone. Pillar, who had been standing in the doorway for the past 3 minutes without anyone acknowledging her, said, That's what they've been trying to neutralize for 17 years. Human annoyance at inconvenience. Everyone turned to look at her. I'm Pillar Hess, she said. I do the patrol analysis. I've been listening because I do that. She came into the room, the 3 kilohertz band. It doesn't cause fear. It causes the opposite of irritation. It makes everything feel not worth the effort. It's not that you're paralyzed. It's that you stop caring that you should move. She put a diagram on the table. I mapped the unit's positions over the past 3 weeks. It's not a patrol circuit. It's a broadcast arc. It's been slowly, incrementally covering the compound's perimeter, not trying to get in, just singing at us. Rail looked at the diagram for a long time. They're not attacking, he said. No. They're deflating. Yes. Which means they know they can't take this compound by force. Or they could, Oren said, but they want us to stop first. They want us to stop before they get here. The plan took 4 hours to build and had the quality of plans that emerge when people who are exhausted and pressed for time have stopped trying to be elegant and are just trying to be right. Marin had expected Rail to take over the planning. That was what commanders did, what the statue implied, what 17 years of stories had suggested, but he didn't. He sat at the table and asked questions, and each question was a chisel. And by the end of the first hour, the plan that Pillar had started and Oren had modified and Marin had shaped was sharper than anything they'd had before. He added 3 things. The first was a distribution schedule for the compound's existing acoustic dampening equipment. Emergency panels originally designed to reduce blast noise in the repair bays, which Pillar had already noted might have partial effect on the 3 kHz band. Rail's modification was in the distribution, not spread evenly, but concentrated in a moving arc that would rotate around the compound in the same pattern the Voth unit was using. Match the broadcast radius, not the broadcast itself. We're not trying to block it, he explained. Blocking it completely would require more power than we have and would probably tell them we know what they're doing. We're trying to make it inconsistent, patchy. If the effect on motivation is constant, people adapt to it unconsciously or fail to. If it's inconsistent, intermittent, people notice the absence, and that noticing wakes something up. The second thing he added was himself, not as the tactical commander, as a signal source. I'm going to walk the perimeter, he said. Oren looked at him. At 3 kHz you'll feel it too. Yes. You're not immune. I know. Then what exactly are you walking the perimeter for? Rail was quiet for a moment. Because they've spent 17 years trying to understand what I did at Kepler, they've concluded it was certainty. They've built a weapon to counteract certainty. He stood up. They're wrong about what it was, and if I walk that perimeter while their unit is active, they'll get new data. They'll see that their model is still incomplete. 17 more years of trying to understand something they've misidentified. That's the plan, Oren said. Confuse them. That's one part of the plan. The other part is that I'm going to walk the perimeter and hum. He said it completely without self-consciousness. The same way I did at Kepler, not because it's technically decisive, because it's what I was doing. And the people in this compound have been living under that signal for 3 weeks. They need to hear something that isn't it. Marin said, You're going to give them the irritated version. He looked at her. What else would I give them? The walk took 40 minutes. Marin watched it on 3 different screens simultaneously. Exterior optical, thermal, and the acoustic readout that Pillar had rigged to display the 3 kHz band as a visible color gradient. A slow wash of amber across the compound's outline that had been there so long she'd stopped noticing it the way you stopped noticing a smell. Rail stepped out of the main hatch at 3:40 hours. No weapon visible, though she knew he had one. Maintenance jacket. Same one he'd arrived in. He walked along the eastern perimeter wall at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow. It was the pace of a man who had somewhere to be and was getting there, and the somewhere and the getting were both equally unremarkable. The acoustic readout changed within 90 seconds. Not dramatically. Not in the way she'd hoped, not a sudden collapse of the amber color, but the gradient shifted unevenly in patches that seemed to follow him at a delay of about 15 seconds. Wherever he'd been, the color was different. Not gone, just different. And then she heard it through the external mic feed. It wasn't a melody. It was barely a sound. A low, steady, continuous exhalation of breath with a slight vocalization behind it. A frequency she couldn't have named but recognized immediately as the sound of someone who was deeply, fundamentally, personally inconvenienced by the situation they found themselves in, and was moving through it anyway, because what else were you going to do? Over the compound's internal comms, which Pillar had kept open on all channels, she heard someone laugh. It was a short, startled sound, not a joke laugh, not a social laugh, but the laugh that comes out of you when something is so specifically, recognizably human that your body responds before your brain can. She heard it from the medical bay, then from the maintenance ring, then from 2 voices she couldn't place. The amber on the acoustic readout kept shifting. Oren appeared beside her at 3:47. He stood and watched the screens without speaking. After a long moment he said, He really is just annoyed. Yes. 17 years of stories, that's what it was. That's what it was. Oren made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. and wasn't quite something else. The Voth spent 17 years trying to neutralize human certainty. And they were wrong about what they were neutralizing. They've been modeling the wrong thing, Marin said. They think we keep going because we're certain we'll win. We're not. No, she watched the screens. We keep going because we're annoyed that we have to stop. At 4:12, the Voth harmonic unit's signal shifted. Pillar caught it first, a frequency modulation, the 3 kHz band fluctuating in a pattern that none of the archive files had ever recorded. It wasn't an attack. It wasn't a retreat. It was, as far as Pillar could describe it in the report she wrote an hour later, an adjustment. The unit was running new calculations. 17 more years, Rail said when he came back inside. He was slightly winded. There was a new grass stain on the knee of his maintenance jacket that had not been there before. What happened to your knee? Marin asked. Tripped on a root. You were humming at a Voth harmonic unit, and you tripped on a root. It was dark. He looked at her expression. The root was there. I wasn't going to walk around it. She didn't say anything for a moment. The signals changed, she finally said. The unit's recalculating. I know, I felt it shift. What did it feel like? He thought about this seriously, the way he thought about everything, without hurrying to the answer. Like when you're in the middle of doing something necessary, and something tries to make you feel like it isn't. And then the something realizes you're not listening and has to go reconsider its approach. He walked to the water station and filled a cup. They'll be back, different frequency probably, better calibrated. And we'll have to do this again. Probably several times. He drank the water. That's usually how it works. The compound had a different quality to it by morning. Marin couldn't have quantified it, and she didn't try. It was in small things, the mechanic in the repair bay humming something under her breath without noticing. The 2 cell members who'd stopped eating both turning up for the morning briefing. Oren standing in the main square with a coffee looking at the statue with an expression that wasn't reverence but wasn't dismissal either. Rail was in the comms room at dawn, working through the archive files with Pillar, and a young technician named Dax. Not named for him. He'd been informed. An unfortunate coincidence that the kid had been dealing with since birth. The 3 of them were building a frequency map of every Voth harmonic engagement on record, which was tedious work that required cross-referencing 47 years of badly formatted resistance records. And they were doing it in silence, except for occasional questions and the sound of someone tapping on a screen. Marin brought him a coffee around 600. He took it without looking up. You're not what the stories made you, she said. Usually not, he said. The stories made you invincible. The stories were trying to explain something that didn't have a clean explanation. He finally looked at her. What did you expect? She thought about it honestly. Someone who knew something nobody else knew. Some answer the Voth had given us access to by mistake at Kepler that you'd been carrying for 17 years. And you don't have an answer. I have the same data everyone has, he said. I'm just not embarrassed by what the data says, which is that the Voth keep expecting us to behave like a species that's trying to calculate whether survival is worth the cost, and we keep not doing that. He looked back at his work. It's not strategy. It's just, that's not how we work. We don't calculate whether it's worth it. We just get annoyed that the problem's still there and keep moving. Is that enough? He was quiet for a moment. Has been so far. Pillar, without looking up from her screen, said, This is either the most reassuring or the most terrifying answer I've ever heard. Yes, Rail agreed. The frequency map they finished by noon showed something that Pillar had suspected, and Rail confirmed. The Voth's acoustic engagement strategy had shifted 3 times in the past decade, each shift a response to a human behavior that hadn't matched their model. The first shift had come after Kepler, from paralysis frequency to something more targeted. The second had come 5 years later, after a supply convoy that should have surrendered instead drove straight through a harmonic field on what the crew later described as pure spite. The third was the 3 kHz band they were dealing with now, the motivation dampener, the anti-irritant, the attempt to remove from human beings the specific quality that kept making their calculations wrong. They keep trying to fix for the wrong variable, Pillar said. They're not wrong that certainty matters, Rail said. They're wrong about what produces it. They think it comes from knowing you'll succeed. It doesn't. Where does it come from? The young technician, young Dax, asked. He was 23, and he asked the question with the straightforwardness of someone who didn't know yet that some questions were supposed to be rhetorical. Rail considered him. Have you ever fixed something that was definitely going to break again in a week? Every day. Did you fix it? Obviously. That, Rail said. Young Dax looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at his screen and said, "Huh," and went back to work. The Voth unit returned on the third night. Different frequency, as Rail had predicted, not 3 kHz but a sweeping band that shifted continuously, harder to track, harder to model against. Pillar caught it first and had the alert out before it was inside their perimeter's scan range. The compound came to readiness in under 4 minutes, which was better than their drill time, and which Marin noted in her log with the particular satisfaction of someone who had worked on that number for months. Rail was already suited up when she got to the briefing room. Same approach, she asked. Variations. He had a copy of Pillar's frequency map in his hand. The sweep pattern means they can't sustain any single frequency long enough to get the full motivational effect. They're trying something different. What? I don't know yet. He said it comfortably, the way he said most things. I'll find out when I'm out there. Oren appeared in the doorway. I'm going with you. Rail looked at him. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. Oren's voice had something in it that hadn't been there when Rail arrived, not warmth exactly, but something that had decided to open the door a little wider. You tripped on a root in the dark. I know where the roots are. Rail regarded him for a moment. Then something shifted in his expression that might have been the closest thing to humor she'd seen from him. Fair. The two of them went out together into the dark, and Marin watched from the screens again. And this time the sound through the external mics was 2 voices. Not one, Rail's low, steady hum, and something from Oren that wasn't a hum but was close. A sound he'd probably have been embarrassed to name. And the acoustic readout shifted in a different pattern, broader, more irregular, like static that had decided it had a direction. The compound's comm stayed open. The laugh that came this time was from more voices. The Voth filed 17 new observational reports that week. Marin knew this because the Resistance's Intercepted Intelligence Division, which operated out of a different compound 200 kilometers south, flagged all 17 for distribution, and each one contained some variation of the phrase that had become, in the 17 years since Kepler, the closest thing the Voth had to a standing admission. Human behavior remains inconsistent with predicted threat response modeling. She pinned the latest one on the wall above her bunk, next to the old memo. The old memo said, "We have not yet determined what expression the human is making. We do not believe it is fear." The new one said, "Compound 7 engagement has produced behavioral data that does not conform to any motivation disruption model currently in use." The primary operative moved through the active field at walking pace. Secondary operative's behavioral signature is also unclassified. We are updating our models. She read both of them, then she turned off her light. In the main square, the statue stood in the dark with its arm outstretched, fist closed around something invisible. The sculptor had gotten the posture right without knowing what it meant. It wasn't a victory pose. It wasn't a threat. It was the pose of a man who was in the middle of fixing something that was going to break again, and was fixing it anyway, because the alternative was not fixing it. And that was obviously not an option. and the Voth had been studying it for 17 years trying to understand what made a person look like that. And the reason they kept coming back to study it was that they still didn't know. That was the part nobody put in the official stories. The stories had him striding forward, fearless, certain, chosen. The reality was that he'd been on shift for 22 hours and the corridor smelled terrible and he was annoyed. The Voth would not figure that out. Not because they weren't capable. They were extraordinarily capable, meticulous and patient and precise, in ways that made most human planning look rough around the edges. But because to understand it, you had to understand why a species would fix something for the 20th time when it was going to break for the 21st. You had to understand why Orrin Cast had spent 40 years in a compound that had cost him everything and still showed up to the morning briefing. You had to understand why a young technician named Dax, who was not named for a commander and was a little tired of people making that joke, had been mapping Voth frequency patterns since 300 because the map wasn't done. The Voth were modeling certainty. They were modeling conviction, belief, the kind of grand narrative that sustains a species through impossible odds. What they kept missing was the other thing, the smaller thing, the thing that was harder to write into a memo or a statue or a story told for 17 years. The thing where you just keep going. Not because you know it will work, not because you've calculated the odds, but because the alternative is to stop, and stopping is annoying, and the work is still there, and you're already here, and you might as well. The Voth didn't have a word for it. Humans, if you asked them, usually just called it a bad week they were getting through. The statue stood in the dark, the compound breathed around it. In the comms room, a light was still on. 3 days after the second engagement, Rael asked Marin to show him the archive room. It wasn't a room so much as a converted storage bay, low-ceilinged and perpetually damp, lined with salvaged data units that had been repurposed as file servers. The Resistance's institutional memory lived in here. Engagement reports, casualty records, tactical debriefs going back 40 years, all of it cross-indexed by a filing system that the compound's previous operations chief had invented, which meant that finding anything required knowing how that particular person's mind had worked, which meant that effectively only Orrin could find anything without spending an hour on it. Rael didn't spend an hour on it. He went directly to a section of the archive Marin had never specifically sought out, not because she didn't know it was there, but because looking at casualty records from operations that had taken place before she was born was the kind of task that slid off her to-do list in the same way that any task does when you're not ready for what it will cost you. He pulled 3 files. Read them in silence. Put them back. "How many people have you lost?" he asked, not looking at her. "In 8 months," she did the math without wanting to. 11. 2 in extraction operations, 1 in a Voth perimeter breach, 2 to illness we couldn't treat in time, 1, she stopped. 1 chose to go into the perimeter alone, we don't know why. We called it a tactical decision in the file. Rael was quiet for a moment. "The 3 kilohertz field," he said. "How long had it been active before that happened?" She hadn't made that connection, she made it now. 3 days. "Yeah," he closed the last file. "That's what they're doing, not trying to take the compound, taking individual people, one at a time. The math is patient." He looked at her. "How many people total in the compound?" 231. "How many are children?" 64. Something shifted in his face. Not dramatically. It was the same controlled stillness he brought to everything. But something behind his eyes changed in the way that things change when a person who has been treating a situation as a tactical problem suddenly allows it to be a human one, just for a moment, before sealing it back up. "All right," he said. "There's something I didn't tell you in the briefing." She waited. "The frequency work I did at Kepler, the humming, whatever it actually was, I've tried to replicate it since, on purpose, in controlled conditions." He sat down on a salvage crate. "It doesn't replicate. I've had acoustic specialists try to model it. I've done it in front of monitoring equipment. The frequency output is inconsistent. Some sessions the dampening effect on Voth emissions shows up clearly, others it barely registers. He looked at his hands. It wasn't a technique, it was an incident. I was on hour 22 of a shift. I was genuinely, personally irritated. The choir hit me with paralysis frequency, and it just didn't work the same way it was supposed to, probably because of whatever my nervous system was doing at the time, which I can't replicate because I can't make myself that tired and that genuinely irritated on a schedule. So the story is true, Marin said slowly, but not the way people tell it. The story is true. The version that's useful is harder to pass on. She thought about that. Because you can't train someone to be authentically annoyed. You can't train someone to not be performing. The thing that messed with the choir's model was that I wasn't behaving strategically. I was behaving like someone who had things to do, and this was in the way. He looked up. The Voth model human behavior as purposive. Everything we do in their model is aimed at a goal we've calculated the value of. Even our heroism, especially our heroism. They expect us to make a choice to be courageous. What they can't model is the version where there isn't a choice, because we're just already moving, and the problem is in the way. And the 3 kilohertz field targets exactly that, not the goal-directed behavior, the underlying thing that keeps us moving before we've decided to. The thing that makes you fix the water recycler without thinking about whether civilization is worth saving while you're doing it. If they can switch that off, we'd still have reasons to fight, Marin said. We'd still have values, we just wouldn't be able to get out of the chair, he finished. That's what happened to your crew member who went into the perimeter. Not that they stopped believing, that they stopped being able to close the gap between believing and doing. The archive room hummed around them. Data units ancient and overworked. What do we do about it? She asked. He thought about it in the way he thought about everything, not fast, not slow, just at exactly the speed that matched the actual complexity of the thing being considered. We can't replicate what I did. But we can model it, not the frequency, the condition, the pre-deliberative state, the state where you're already in motion before you've decided to move. He stood up. What does this compound do that nobody thinks about? What's the background noise of this place? What? The things that happen without anyone scheduling them, without anyone deciding. The things that are just part of being here. Marin thought about it. Brecht hums in the repair bay. I heard that. Young Dax triple-checks his work even when he's finished. He doesn't trust himself to know when something's done. Good instinct, actually. Oren cleans his mug before and after every briefing. Has done it for 40 years, I'm told. Nobody's ever asked him why. She paused. There's a corner in the medical bay where people go to not be doing something. Not sleeping. Not resting on schedule, just standing, looking at a wall. People take turns. How many people use that corner? On a slow day, maybe 6 or 7 when things are bad, she thought about it. Almost everyone at some point. He nodded slowly. Those are the things we protect, not the reasons, not the ideology, not the strategic objectives, though those matter too. He looked at her steadily. The Voth have been modeling our resistance as a function of our conviction that we're right, that we believe hard enough. What they haven't modeled is the background frequency, the humming in the repair bay, the triple checking. The corner where people stand and don't do anything, because sometimes that's exactly what you need to do. Marin looked at him for a long moment. You've been thinking about this for 17 years. I've had time. And you came here. Your comms pattern flagged something the Resistance Intelligence Network hadn't seen before, the 3 kilohertz band. He met her eyes. I came because this is where they decided to try next, and I wanted to see what they tried. Are you afraid of what they'll try after this? He considered the question seriously. I'm aware that they're very good and they're learning, yes. A pause. But they keep learning the wrong thing, because what they're studying isn't us. It's their idea of us. The model of us they built from watching our purposive behaviors. He almost smiled. They've never successfully modeled Brecht humming. Marin called a full compound assembly that afternoon. All 231 people, including the children, in the main square with the statue. She'd expected to have to talk people into coming. 3 weeks of low-grade motivational interference tended to make compound-wide gatherings feel optional in a way they technically weren't. But the word had gone around about what had happened the previous 2 nights, about the sound through the comms, about the shift in the readouts. People came because they wanted to. Rael stood to one side. He didn't address the assembly. He'd made it clear, when she'd explained her plan, that he would be present and available, and would answer direct questions but would not be giving a speech. "You've been at compound-wide assemblies before," she'd said. Yes, he hadn't explained further. She hadn't pushed. She'd figured it out later, watching him in the archive room. He knew what happened to people when a legend spoke. The legend confirmed everything the story had built, and the story was wrong in the specific way that mattered, and the corrected version didn't inspire people the same way the wrong version did. He wasn't going to get up in front of 231 people and tell them that the hero of Kepler was just a tired man who was annoyed. Not because it would deflate them. Because they deserved the real version, and the real version required more than a speech. She told them about the 3 kilohertz field. She told them what it did, and how it did it, and how long they'd been under it without knowing. She watched their faces while she talked, the recognition, the sharp kind, where people understood that something they'd been experiencing as an internal failure was in fact an external force. She told them about the corner in the medical bay. "I need you to keep using it," she said, "not as a coping mechanism, not as something you do when you can't cope, as something this compound does, as something that's part of how we function." She looked around the square. "The Voth are modeling our reasons. They're trying to understand what we believe and then neutralize it. What they can't model is the things we do before we decide to do them, the background noise. The whatever it is that this specific group of people does that isn't a strategy." Brecht in the back of the crowd said without raising her hand, "We argue about the coffee." Several people laughed. "Yes," Marin said. "We argue about the coffee. We argue about it constantly. It's terrible coffee. There's an ongoing dispute about whether it's better to drink it fast before you can taste it or slow to maximize the caffeine absorption. And this dispute has been running for, I'm told, 11 years, and it has never been resolved, and it will not be resolved, and people argue about it every morning." She looked at the crowd. "The Voth do not have a model for that, and I want to keep it that way." In the silence that followed, young Dax, the technician, the one who wasn't named for the commander, who was tired of the jokes, raised his hand. "So our plan to stop an alien weapon is to just keep being like this?" "Yes." He thought about it. "That seems too simple. The technical mitigation is Pillar's acoustic countermeasures and the rotating dampener arc, and you should ask her about it because she's better at explaining it than I am." Marin held his gaze. "But the part that actually matters is the part that the Voth can't fix, which is that this compound has 231 people in it, and every one of them has things they do that aren't strategic, and those things are the frequency the Voth can't measure." Rael, from his position at the side of the square, said nothing. She'd seen him briefly look at the statue, look away from it, look at the crowd. He was watching the way you watch something you've been thinking about for a long time and are now seeing in person, with the attention of someone making sure the real thing matched what they'd been carrying. She thought it probably did. She thought the real compound was better than whatever version he'd been maintaining in the back of his head for 17 years. Not more heroic, more specific, more 3 kilohertz field and terrible coffee. More 231 people with corners they stood in and disputes they didn't resolve. More human in the sense that was hard to put in a report. The Voth harmonic unit made one more pass 3 days later. It came differently this time, from 2 directions simultaneously, a pincer configuration that suggested significant tactical recalibration since the last engagement. The frequency band was different again, higher this time, into the 8 kHz range that was closer to traditional paralysis territory, but modulated in a sweep that made it harder to simply dampen. Pillar had the countermeasures running within 4 minutes of the first detection. The rolling acoustic dampener arc went up in 5. Rail was in the repair bay when the alert went out. He was helping Brecht replace a relay panel, not because he'd been assigned to it, because he'd noticed the relay panel and mentioned to Brecht that it looked like it needed replacing, and Brecht had said she'd been meaning to get to it, and they'd both just continued standing near it until one of them picked up a tool, and then it was a repair. He came out when the alert went, but not before telling Brecht what setting to use on the coupling tool when she finished, because leaving a job half done was obviously not acceptable. The walk took 53 minutes this time, Rail and Oren both, with Pillar on comms running frequency updates in real time. The 2-direction approach meant they had to split the perimeter differently, cover more ground, which meant less time in any one spot. The acoustic readout showed the countermeasures holding well on the north side, less well on the east, where the sweep pattern was densest. Marin watched the screens and talked Pillar through 2 adjustments. At 2:28 hours, the Voth unit's signal cut off entirely. Not a modulation, not a frequency shift, a complete cessation. Pillar stared at her screens for 10 seconds in silence. "That's not a tactical withdrawal pattern," she said. "What is it?" "I don't know," she pulled the logs. "The signal just stopped, like they shut it down." She looked up. They didn't complete the arc. They were maybe 60% through the configured pass. Oren's voice came through the comms from outside. "Compound, the unit is retracting. Withdrawal vector is direct, not evasive. They're not covering their departure." Marin stared at the screen. "They're leaving because they chose to, not because we stopped them." "Yes." She thought about what that meant. What it meant for the Voth to choose to stop an engagement mid-cycle when they were progressing, when the tactical indicators were in their favor, when their model said they should continue. "They got new data," she said. Pillar nodded slowly. "Something we did tonight didn't match what they expected, and they decided they needed to go update the model before continuing." "What didn't match?" "I don't know yet. I'll need to run the logs." Pillar's voice had the quality of someone who was going to be awake for another 6 hours. "It might be the relay panel." Marin blinked. "What?" Brecht and Commander Rail were repairing a relay panel when the alert went. The panel's on the east wall of the repair bay. The east side is where the sweep was densest. The panel puts out a slight electromagnetic signature during installation that wasn't in the Voth's environmental model of this compound. A small thing, an irrelevant thing in any tactical analysis. Pillar was already pulling the data. But Voth tactical systems cross-reference against a complete environmental baseline. An unexpected signature mid-engagement would have flagged. "You're saying they withdrew because someone was fixing a relay panel." "I'm saying they withdrew because the compound wasn't behaving the way their model said it should. And the data point that broke the model might have been a relay panel being fixed at 2 in the morning during an active harmonic engagement, because 2 people noticed it needed fixing and just kept going." In the corridor outside the comms room, Rail came back through the hatch. His maintenance jacket had relay grease on the cuff. He looked at Marin's expression. "What happened?" he asked. "They withdrew." He processed this. "Why?" "Best current theory, the repair bay." He looked at his cuff. A long pause. Then, quietly, with the tone of someone who was absolutely not going to turn this into a speech. "Huh. Yeah." They stood in the corridor for a moment. "The relay panel's done," he said. Brecht finished it. Good. It needed doing. I know. He went to get water. She went back to the screens. Somewhere in the compound, in the corner of the medical bay, someone was standing and looking at a wall and not doing anything, which was exactly what they needed to do, and nobody had scheduled it, and nobody was going to write it in a report. And it was the most important thing happening in the compound at that moment, or possibly the second most important, after Pillar's frequency logs. The Voth harmonic unit did not return. It would come back eventually, they all knew that. The Resistance Intelligence Network put out an assessment 6 weeks later noting increased Voth acoustic research activity across 3 sectors, which meant they were incorporating the Compound 7 data into something broader, something that would eventually produce a new approach. The network's assessment rated Compound 7's situation as currently stable and projected elevated engagement probability in the next 6 to 18 months. Oren read the assessment, filed it, and went to clean his mug before the morning briefing. Young Dax finished the frequency map and found 4 additional patterns in the historical data that nobody had cross-referenced before, wrote it up, submitted it to the network, then went back and checked it twice because he didn't trust himself to know when something was done. Brecht identified 2 more relay panels that needed replacing and got to them on her own schedule, which was to say whenever she was near them, and had a tool in her hand, which turned out to be a reasonably efficient maintenance system. Marin updated the cell's tactical protocols and wrote a section she hadn't expected to write, titled Ambient Behavioral Norms, which attempted to document the things the compound did that weren't strategies, but that had demonstrably affected a Voth tactical assessment. She wrote it carefully, trying to be accurate without being absurd, and deleted the first 3 drafts because they were either too clinical or tried too hard to make the coffee argument sound meaningful in a sentence. The 4th draft just described it plainly. She submitted it. It got flagged by the network's tactical review team as unusually formatted, and was circulated to 9 other compounds as an example of a new category of operational intelligence they hadn't previously had terminology for. Rael stayed for 3 weeks and then moved on. He told her 2 days before he left, which was more notice than she'd expected. He told her where he was going, which was to a compound near the Kepler corridor that had reported a new kind of Voth survey drone, and which had also apparently fielded a question from its current operations chief about what to do when crew members stopped caring whether things got fixed. Same thing, he said. Walk the perimeter and hum. Not literally, necessarily. He was repacking his kit, same kit he'd arrived with. The principle, make noise that doesn't fit their model, be specific in a way they can't predict, do the relay panel. He closed the kit. Don't let them decide what humanity sounds like. What does humanity sound like? She asked. He thought about it. Genuinely, carefully, in the way that she'd come to recognize as his actual processing, rather than a performance of considering. Brecht, he said, the humming in the repair bay. He left at 600. Marin was at the hatch. Oren was there too with his coffee mug, which he had cleaned before coming and would clean again when he got back. They didn't make a thing of the departure. Rael didn't look at the statue on the way out, which she'd expected, but he slowed slightly when he passed it, not stopping, not looking, but slowing, in the way that you slow near something you've made a decision about. She didn't know what the decision was. She didn't ask. The transport's landing struts lifted in the same 3-point pattern they'd arrived in. The ship went sunward, which was still wrong by normal protocol and probably still deliberate for reasons she'd never gotten around to asking about. In the main square, the statue stood with its arm outstretched and its fist closed. In the repair bay, Brecht was already at work, humming something without words, without melody, without any particular intention except that there was work to do and she was doing it, and the sound was part of doing it and had always been. In the same way that every person in this compound had a particular frequency, they put out that was theirs and specific and untranslatable into a Voth observational report. Marin had 231 people to look after, and a compound that needed its water recycler checked, and pillars frequency maps to review before the afternoon briefing, and a corner in the medical bay she hadn't been to in a week. She started with the corner. Not because it was strategic, not because she'd calculated that it would help, but because it was there and she had 2 minutes and the wall had never done anything wrong, and looking at it for a little while before the day got going was just what she did. The compound hummed around her. It had its own frequency, not measurable, not modelable, not anything the Voth had ever successfully characterized in 17 years of trying. Just 231 specific people going about the specific business of being themselves, which was the thing that kept breaking the Voth's predictions, and would keep breaking them, not because humanity was unconquerable, but because humanity was irreducibly particular, and the particular things were the ones that didn't fit the model, and the things that didn't fit the model were the things that bought the next morning, and the morning after that, and the one after that. One relay panel at a time. One coffee argument at a time. One corner in the medical bay at a time. The Voth were very good at modeling certainty. They had never, in 17 years, successfully modeled this. The first thing they told you about Commander Dax Rail was that he never looked at his own statue. The second thing they told you, if you asked the right people in the right order, was that the statue had been built by someone who had never met him, working from a photograph, and that the photograph had been taken by a Voth drone that malfunctioned at exactly the wrong moment, and that the expression on the face in the photograph, the one that 48 Voth resonators had been unable to produce a confident classification for over 17 years, was not courage, not certainty, not conviction. It was the expression of a man who had been on shift for 22 hours and had things to do, and was personally, specifically, genuinely irritated that the problem was still there. This was the version of the story that Marin put in the compound's operational log, under a heading she hadn't expected to write, and which she eventually titled simply, "What Kepler Actually Was." She wrote it because the right version mattered, not because the wrong version, the heroic one, the certain one, the statue version, wasn't useful. It was useful. It had kept people going for 17 years. Stories that were wrong in the specific ways that mattered to survival had their own kind of truth. But the right version was also useful, in a different way, for a different purpose, and the Voth had spent 17 years unsuccessfully modeling the wrong version, and it seemed worth writing down what they'd actually been failing to model. What they'd been failing to model was not a man, not even a moment. What they'd been failing to model was a quality that didn't have a clean name, that expressed itself differently in every person in the compound, that was identical in structure to what Rail had done at Kepler, even though the expression of it was Brecht humming, and young Dax checking his work twice, and Oren cleaning his mug, and 64 children who were doing what children do, which is everything without editorial, without deciding whether it's worth it. The Voth were excellent scientists. They observed carefully, modeled rigorously, updated when the data required it. They had been updating their model of humanity since Kepler, and each update had been technically correct. They had identified real variables, real patterns, real behavioral tendencies, and each update had also been wrong in the same fundamental way, because the variable they kept studying was not the variable that was making their predictions fail. They were studying humanity's reasons. They couldn't study the thing underneath the reasons, not because it was hidden, because it was too ambient to read as signal. It was everywhere, constant, part of the background frequency of a species that just kept going, not toward anything in particular, not because of any particular belief. Just forward, because the relay panel needed fixing and the coffee needed arguing about and the corner needed standing in, and stopping was obviously not an option because there was still a relay panel. Marin finished the log entry at 4:30 in the morning, when the compound was at its quietest except for Pillar's screens, which were always on, and Breck's bay, where the light was always on. She read it back once. It was not an inspiring document. It was specific and concrete and tried very hard to be accurate, and accuracy about this particular thing tended to produce documents that weren't inspiring so much as they were just right. She submitted it to the network, flagged it for compound operations chief specifically, not tactical analysts, not command structure. She got 47 responses within 2 days. Most of them said some version of the same thing. We have this too. We didn't know it was a thing until you named it. We thought it was just us. It was just them. That was the whole point. Each compound, each cell, each group of people living under Voth acoustic suppression and doing the work anyway had its own version of it. The specific ambient behaviors that didn't show up in tactical reports, the background frequency of being those particular people. One compound had a weekly argument about card game rules that had never been resolved. Another had a mechanic who narrated everything she was doing while she worked, to no one in particular, a constant running commentary that the other cell members had stopped hearing years ago the way you stop hearing a clock. A third had a door hinge that everyone knew squeaked and nobody had fixed for 6 years, not because they couldn't fix it, but because the squeak had become part of the compound's texture, and there was a general ambient consensus that fixing it would feel wrong, which was a consensus that had never been formally stated and would have been embarrassing to state, but was real. The Voth could not model the squeaky door hinge. They could not model it because it wasn't meaningful in any way they had categories for, and yet it was meaningful. It was part of how 200 people who lived and fought together knew they were home, and knowing you were home was part of the thing that Rael had been walking toward at Kepler without knowing he was walking toward it. Marin wrote a short follow-up note to the network which she titled, "On Squeaky Hinges." It was 3 paragraphs. It said, "Do not fix the squeaky hinge, not because the hinge matters, because the decision not to fix it is yours and specific and part of your compound's frequency, and the Voth cannot model a tactical asset that looks exactly like a maintenance failure. Let them keep not modeling it. Let every compound have its own version. The heterogeneity is the point. The beautiful, irreducible, modeling-resistant fact that 240 resistance cells each have a slightly different answer to the question of what it sounds like when people keep going." She sent it. Then she went to the corner in the medical bay and stood there for 10 minutes, because 10 minutes was what she had before the morning briefing, and the morning briefing required her to have been somewhere that wasn't the briefing first. The compound hummed. The frequency was specific and constant and untranslatable. Somewhere the Voth were updating their models. They would keep updating them. They would get closer and closer to the right answer. They were excellent scientists, patient and precise, and they had 17 years of observational data and were gathering more. And eventually, maybe in another 17 years, maybe in 50, maybe in 100, they would build a model that was close enough to accurate that the gap between the model and the reality was no longer tactically significant. But not yet. Not today. Today the model was still wrong, in the specific ways that mattered, and the compound was still humming, and Brecht was at work, and young Dax was checking something twice, and Oren was cleaning his mug, and in a corner of the medical bay a woman who ran a resistance cell stood and looked at a wall for 10 minutes because that was what she did, and the Voth had no category for it, and that was enough. It was going to have to be enough. It was.